Thank you very much. Minister, while there have been disappointments in relation to, as well as some progress, but also disappointments in relation to political reform in terms of your brief, prominent amongst which I believe is the failure to hold a referendum on the right to vote at 16, something which had been promised. And when we look to 16-year-olds leading the world today, I think it's extremely unfortunate that that referendum was not held as promised last June. While there are many other issues I could speak to, I will be clear. I think that it should be on Taoiseach, who is here in the House today. I believe, Minister, that it should be the Taoiseach who is answering these statements and who is engaging with us on the issue of Seanad reform. Because let us be very clear, the report that we are discussing is a report requested specifically by the Taoiseach. It is specifically an initiative and a promise made in the programme for government related to the Taoiseach. And I believe he should be facing these statements. He should be answering the questions. I will turn in a moment to some of the inconsistencies in the statement that the Taoiseach has made over the last period of time. But perhaps let's take a step back first of all and talk about the question of what mandate there is. We are not simply brainstorming possible solutions to what might be an ideal form of Seanad reform. This report was based on a very clear mandate, and the origins of that mandate are very, very serious. A 2013 referendum in which the public, all of the public, not simply those few members of the public who currently have the opportunity to vote in Seanad elections, but all of the public chose and cast their vote in a referendum, and they chose to retain the Seanad and to reform it. And that was the mandate that was given. And that is something that was acknowledged by the Taoiseach himself previously when he spoke about the public did not endorse the status quo, they wanted reform. That is in 2013. But let us go a little bit further back to 1979, in a previous referendum, one which was also incorporated in the work of Maurice Manning in his report, which is also reflected in the legislation, real legislation that we brought to the House. The 1979 referendum, which is in fact of the same vintage now as the Taoiseach, that 1979 referendum passed by 92%. 92% of citizens gave a constitutional imperative for the expansion of the university franchise. So we have a huge mandate for expansion of the university franchise. We have a mandate in 2013 for reform. We move forward and we have the Manning report, cross-party work, bringing together all of the previous work on this, and the programme for government, which, Minister, you represent and over which the Taoiseach has ultimate responsibilities, includes a clear commitment not to discuss the Manning report, but to implement the Manning report. On the very first day that this 25th Seanad met, a Seanad which existed by the grace of the Irish public, with a mandate to reform, on that first day that we sat, 11 members of this House, including myself, Senator McDougall and 9 others, put forward a bill to implement the Manning report. We were asked and requested by the then Taoiseach not to progress further with our bill because the government wished to engage, and explicitly the Taoiseach's office wished to engage and lead out on the process of implementing the Manning report, so committed were they. And we agreed to, in the spirit of good faith, engage in a process, form a committee. A number of us who are here today were members of that committee. We sat for many, many hours on that committee, and we produced, according to explicit terms that we had been given, the terms of reference, how does one implement the Manning report, what small changes, technical or others, might be necessary in order to deliver effective implementation. And crucially, we've produced a new piece of legislation This is no longer a piece of legislation from 11 senators. This is a piece of legislation drafted by a committee, put together by the government themselves. And that committee's legislation, cross-party legislation, was agreed. Agreed is not consensus. Agreed is agreed. I, for one, and I know many others, sat in a room and we voted paragraph by paragraph at times. Were there elements that I would have liked to have in there? Yes, I didn't win every vote. Were there elements that Senator Warfield would have liked? Yes, there were. But we agreed, and to be very clear, this is agreed legislation. And the statements, this much talked about 4 alternative reports, these are 4 supplementary documents. And to be very clear on them, one of them speaks to somebody who doesn't want to see the Seanad reformed but abolished. Another speaks in terms of additional issues. Because we took the terms of reference seriously, because we took the programme for government seriously around implementation of Manning, any additional ideas for constitutional reform were put into that supplementary area to say, yes, once we take the long overdue, long mandated, necessary steps that are there from constitutional imperative in 1979, from a referendum in 2013, in the programme for government, once we've done that, we all have other ideas about other things that we may wish to do, and that's what's in the supplementary section. So this idea that it's ambiguous and it's impossible, it's not. It's there, this is legislation, and Minister, I have to challenge you on what I believe was a very disingenuous opening to your own speech, where you spoke about a conservative estimate of 53 million. No, 5.3. Of 5.3, a conservative estimate of 5.3 million. Where this estimate is coming from, why it is considered conservative, and then at the very end of your speech, you acknowledge that, in fact, it's very much within your control as Minister to determine and set what the scale of this overseas vote might be. Because it's very clear, it explicitly says that the definition of resident outside the state, this is the person who has an Irish passport, who is resident outside the state, who may be able to vote in this referendum. The definition is a person who has continuously been resident outside the state for a period not exceeding the period which has been prescribed by the Minister. It may be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years. If, as the evidence shown to us by academic experts shown, that the uptake, certainly for example in the case of the Mexican diaspora and their vote, is not as large as feared or not as large as spoken about, once that debate happens, indeed, it may be changed by future ministers. But let's not be clear, this is not some kind of abstract amount where we say every single person claiming Irish citizenship. This is an issue which can evolve and be changed. And that is what is in the legislation. That was acknowledged by you at the end of your speech, Minister, but in no way reflected in the speech at the beginning, where what we've heard again and again and again, we hear about, and from the Taoiseach as well, the millions and millions who may suddenly appear and who may immediately claim a vote. I think we need to be really, really clear about that and about the facts in relation to that. I'm looking to the Taoiseach's quote, "I have decided that a Seanad committee shall be established." And at the time when the Taoiseach, current Taoiseach, spoke about the Seanad committee, he said, "Everyone supports reform, but are much less enthusiastic about change." And it is the case that we hear a lot of lip service to reform, but this government, and Fine Gael specifically, has proven to be extremely unenthusiastic about change in relation to the Seanad. The lack of enthusiasm, which was reflected by the Taoiseach saying that he wouldn't stand in the way of anyone who brought legislation. We brought legislation on the first day of this Seanad. He has stood in the way of that legislation by seeking engagement in an implementation process with others. That has been an obstruction to the last 2 years. And I would like to say this is the legislation prepared for the Taoiseach, which should be put forward. But let's be really clear, the most important thing that he has stood in the way of, and that this Taoiseach has stood in the way of, he has stood in the way of universal suffrage. He has stood in the way of every person walking around in the streets here who would want to have a chance to vote. The very key principle that every person would have an opportunity to vote in the Seanad elections and to be reflected in some way has been challenged. So I don't want to hear
nonsense.
Excuse me.
The challenge?
Sorry, Minister,
please. Apologies. Yeah. The Minister will have his opportunity.
Sorry, yes.
When the Taoiseach...
Point out where your reference.
In his speech in the Dáil, speaking to this report, he said that he questioned the idea of changing the votes so that councillors would cede some of their seats to the public. And that is a key concern.
He didn't say that.
Sorry, excuse me.
He had concerns.
You should read
Alex, please.
Excuse me. He had concerns.
He had
concerns.
Please, Minister, you have an opportunity.
Concerns about the loss of voting power for councillors.
He did not.
Sorry, Minister, please. Senator, your time is. Sorry, Minister.
Speakers have actually had some basis in what to say.
Sorry.
That is utter lie.
Minister, please, we get an opportunity to respond at the end of the statements. Senator Higgins, please. You're about to conclude.
I will happily look up the reference and I will come back to the minute. But let's be very clear.
Sorry, Minister, please.
Excuse me.
Please,
apologies. Through the chair, please. Can we? Through the chair. I will check that reference and I will ensure that it's accurate and we will make sure that the record is correct. However, I will stand by the fact that An Taoiseach has not delivered on his programme for government commitment to implement Manning, that in his delays consistently in moving forward in this issue and in his refusal to put forward legislation, this government has not put forward legislation on this. He has stood in the way of the delivery of Seanad reform, and we now move towards the end of the 25th Seanad with no action and no legislation put forward by the government to implement the Manning report, thereby failing in relation to the programme for partnership government, failing in relation to that commitment. So I do think, the Minister, you do need to acknowledge in that regard that the Taoiseach has stood in the way of the delivery of meaningful Seanad reform.
Perfect.
Thank you, Senator Higgins. Thank you.